What's up everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you joining me for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China. I started putting these videos together for my mates back home. They were interested in the country and they said you should throw this stuff up on YouTube. So I do this about once a week. If that's something that you might be interested in, following the macro developments coming out of China, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, it is wonderful to see you guys. This will either be going up Saturday night or Sunday night. I have another business trip this weekend, but I'm going to a lower tier city, and sometimes the internet can be a little bit unreliable, especially if you're using a VPN. So if this goes up on Saturday, there hasn't been a problem. If it goes up on Sunday, I'm sorry, I had to wait until I got back to where I live here in Hangzhou to send it up, but hopefully you'll get it sometime over the weekend. And like always guys, it is a massive help because I'm using that VPN and the algorithm on YouTube does not like VPN users. They think I'm a bot. So if you smash that like button, if you enjoy the content, it is a massive help. It tells YouTube that this is legitimate content. Now, I don't want to waste too much time up front. We're going to jump into this week's episode. It's a little bit shorter, but before we do, I wanted to make a couple of quick Hong Kong updates. Last week was a big Hong Kong episode. As you guys know, we talked about it for about 10 minutes. There was a lot to cover. For those who are here and they're interested in Hong Kong, you haven't seen last week's episode, there was a lot in there. International reaction, as well as what's happened in the mainland and locally in Hong Kong. Next week is also likely going to be a big Hong Kong episode. So I'm not going to do a special story this week, but there are a couple of updates that we need to just touch on from this week before we jump into the regular stories. Number one, according to state media, it seems increasingly likely that the controversial national security law that was passed by the National People's Congress about 2 weeks ago now may be implemented within the month. Two, on Thursday, UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab warned, using much stronger language that is typically employed, that imposing the new national security law by bypassing the Hong Kong legislature is in direct conflict with international law. And three, also on Thursday, Tokyo's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said to reporters that Tokyo had expressed, quote, deep concern, unquote, to Beijing over the developments in Hong Kong over the last couple of weeks. Okay, let's jump into the first story. On Monday, the State Council Information Office published a white paper entitled Fighting COVID, China in Action. The white paper outlines China's official account of the history of fighting the epidemic. Unsurprisingly, the white paper painted a glowing picture of the government's efforts in containing the outbreak, saying, quote, making people's lives and health its first priority, China adopted extensive, stringent and thorough containment measures and has for now succeeded in cutting all channels for the transmission of the virus, end quote. Now, the report leaves out many of the serious mistakes international observers have accused China of making throughout December and January especially, including failing to share critical information with the WHO, producing disinformation and attempting to cover up the situation in the early stages. China denies all of these accusations, of course, and continues to maintain that it acted in a fully responsible and transparent manner throughout fighting the coronavirus outbreak. And it still even insists that there is no scientific evidence that the virus even began in China in the first place. As of the filming of this, it seems that the situation is under control in China. There are still daily new cases sporadically appearing across the country. Most seriously, a spat of cases in Beijing, the capital, which is normally politically sensitive during regular times, it now is extra sensitive. And on Friday, it was moved up to a medium threat level because of these new cases. But there still has not been a major outbreak. Officials still remain vigilant against a potential second outbreak, though, which could potentially happen if the situation becomes more serious. Next up, we have a very interesting development with the creation of IPAC, or the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. So the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China was formed last week on the 4th of June, a date of particular significance. I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you why that is. Founded by former UK Tory party leader Ian Duncan Smith, the group of 19 members of parliament from 8 countries and the European Parliament, representing different political parties, announced a new international coalition of legislators who want their governments to take a tougher and united position towards China. In its founding statement, IPAC made the following statement. Quote, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China has been created to promote a coordinated response between democratic states to challenges posed by the present conduct and future ambitions of the People's Republic of China. By developing a common set of principles and frameworks that transcend domestic party divisions and international borders, our democracies will be able to keep the rules-based and human rights systems true to their founding purposes. End quote. Founder Duncan Smith said China's increasingly aggressive diplomacy and use of economic intimidation has accelerated the need for the group, with many of the represented countries still forming their China policy. Now, state media in China this week was very quick to condemn the development, comparing it to the Eight-Nation Alliance, which invaded the Qing Empire in the year 1900 to put down the Yihetuan, or the Militia United in Righteousness. Are they trying to form a new Eight-Nation Alliance? Rubio, here referring to the US Senator, and the other lawmakers need to realize that this is not the year 1900 anymore. China is definitely not the country it was in 1900. They're trying to form an anti-China alliance in the globalized era of the 21st century, and they are doomed to fail. These legislators are still narcissistically staying in the old days of imperialism. End quote. Now, the Militia United in Righteousness movement is better known outside of China by a different name, the Boxer Rebellion. The official position here in China is that the Boxer movement was anti-imperialist in nature, and it resulted in China being invaded and humiliated by foreign powers. Historians outside of China and some within China that have been censored point out, however, that the movement was also ultra-xenophobic, and that the mass murder of foreigners is what caused the Eight-Nation Alliance to be formed and launched, and that the Qing government's decision initially not to protect foreigners and eventually to support the call for their elimination represents a low point in the late Qing dynasty and a period where a deeply insecure government increasingly gave itself over to ultra-nationalistic forces and alienated itself from the international community. As such, state media here comparing IPAC to the Eight-Nation Alliance now is ironic on several different levels. On Monday, the Ministry of Education issued an outline for, quote, ideological and political curriculum in colleges and universities. In the outline, the ministry stressed that political education must be strengthened across all universities, identifying 5 key components of correct education. These are namely, quote, 1. Promoting Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And if you thought that was a mouthful, the Chinese is 习近平新时代中国特色社会主义思想 into teaching materials into the classroom. 2. Enhancing students' political, ideological, and emotional identification of the party's innovative theories and strengthening the 4 self-confidences. 3. Nurturing and practicing socialist core values. 4. Strengthening the education of excellent traditional Chinese culture and vigorously promoting patriotism. 5. Deepening the education of the Constitution. Over the last 18 months or so, there has been a major push to increase ideological and ideology education at the higher education level. This education has always been there. Colleges have taught it and students have studied it to varying degrees. But this current push looks like the party wants this to take a more central role and to have the same level of importance today than it did decades ago. Okay, next up, there's been some diplomatic developments with Anglophone middle powers, places like Canada, the UK and Australia, for example. We've discussed on and off diplomatic developments with Australia. Canada was touched on last week, and now we need to discuss the UK a little bit more, have a bit of an update on that. This week, the UK National Security Council signed off on plans for the UK to work with other Five Eyes security partners to build alternatives to the controversial Chinese telecommunications company Huawei. This week too in the UK, Conservatives have been pushing the Prime Minister to provide a legally binding date to strip Huawei from Britain's 5G network. It seemed only a few months ago the UK was open to having Huawei build part of its 5G infrastructure. But over the last few months, we have seen a big change in the UK's posture towards China. For those of you who have been watching this, you'll know why. Beijing's ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming, expressed that the decision regarding Huawei's position in the UK's 5G infrastructure would, quote, act as a litmus test of whether Beijing is a true and faithful partner of China, end quote. Chinese state media this week also employed the phrase that the UK should not, quote, step out of line, end quote. This is the type of language that has been used against Canada and Australia over the last few weeks. State media is making it increasingly clear that China is willing to use economic cohesion to push its interests if need be, and some also arguing that these nations are already too dependent economically on China to have any other choice. In fact, the nationalistic Global Times wrote about Australia on Wednesday saying, quote, if a new Cold War leads to a China-Australia slowdown, Australia will pay an unbearable price. Given Australia's high dependence on the Chinese economy, an all-round confrontation will have a catastrophic effect on the Australian economy, end quote. Now, China has made the conscious decision to be more assertive in its diplomacy and its international PR efforts, and more aggressive in using economic threats and sanctions as a tool of coercing middle powers, particularly Anglophone middle powers that are US allies. And this is increasingly over matters that don't touch on core national security objectives for Beijing, but merely key foreign policy decisions. It's very telling, for example, that a healthy UK-China relationship hinges on the UK using a private company to build its 5G infrastructure. The UK, Australia, and Canada are all Anglophone middle powers that are descending into complex diplomatic rows with the Middle Kingdom, and it is likely that the situation for all of them is going to get much worse going forward. Okay, last story is also not very optimistic. On Monday, it was reported that US President Donald Trump plans to sign legislation calling for sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for oppressing Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region of China. At this point, the US has not spelled out exactly what the economic response of the US will be specifically to China's decision to pass the national security law on the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And this, I think, will be a test to see whether any of these other laws, including the one that may be signed for Uyghurs, will have any teeth whatsoever. Some China watchers believe that Trump is unlikely to do anything to upset the stock market rally in the US or the general economic performance before the general election later this year, and as such will hold off sanctions of any sort as long as China is making purchases under the Phase 1 trade deal. And to be honest, if following the US-China trade war has taught us anything, it is that it's nearly impossible to predict what the US president might do. Now, while the short-term future of the trade/economic/financial relationship between the US and China is up in the air, the public rhetorical exchanges between the US and China remain incredibly intense. Here are just two examples of exchanges from both sides. And I should point out here that the sort of rhetoric that we're looking at here is being employed by the Chinese side almost daily. This is the sort of stuff that I'm reading in the general Chinese language state media about the US. So here are a couple of examples of the rhetoric we're seeing between the two sides. Quote, the Chinese Communist Party's callous exploitation of the tragic death of George Floyd to justify its authoritarian denial of basic human dignity exposes its true colors yet again. As with dictatorships throughout history, no lie is too so long as it serves the party's lust for power. This laughable propaganda should not fool anyone. And from the Chinese side, quote, Mr. Pompeo is still full of lies and slanders. It's just sad. From Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream in 1963, to George Floyd's moan of I cannot breathe, 57 years have passed, and yet equal rights is still a dream for ethnic minorities in the US, a country where serious systemic racism still exists. This is not foreign propaganda. This is an everyday phenomenon in the American society that should be reflected upon. End quote. In the last week alone, I've seen the US Secretary of State Pompeo described in state media as fat, evil, a liar, and a fake Christian. It is very rare, actually, in Chinese press, especially over the last few decades, to see top officials in the US referred to by name to receive these sort of criticisms. Some have argued that Pompeo is a proxy for Trump himself, but we are also seeing the occasional attack on Trump, which is something that typically does not happen in the state-run media in China. Typically, they will say things like some politicians or some officials, and they will use similar language but not point to people by name. So this is quite a development in the rhetorical exchanges between the countries. With this sort of language being employed, it's difficult to know how exactly the China-US economic relationship can possibly survive and go back to the way it was before a lot of the deterioration in the bilateral relationship. Then again, as we know, money talks, and it often speaks more loudly than all other things. In fact, as of the filming of this, on Friday, the United States Department of Agriculture announced that Chinese purchases of soybeans from the US is at a 16-month high. Okay guys, that was our episode for today. It was a little short. I have a business trip, I'm sorry. If you have any questions or if you have any feedback based on my analysis of my stories, I'd love to see it. It was very domestic heavy this week. Next week I think there's going to be a lot more diplomatic stuff, neighborhood stuff and Hong Kong stuff. So I will see you guys all next week. Have a great weekend and we'll see you then.